Douglas Adams, the author of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series, which is one of my favorite fiction series. He has like a great quote. It's something like, everything that exists in the world when you're born is normal and the way the world should be. Everything that's invented between the time you're 0 and 35 is new and exciting and you could build a career in. And everything that comes into the world after you're 35 is unnatural and against the way things should be and should be stopped.
This week, I'm resharing my conversation with Taylor Pearson. I've been thinking a lot recently about how we make career decisions in uncertain times, and this episode is packed full of interesting ideas, which I'm sure you'll love. Taylor is an author, an investor, and a principal at Mutiny Fund. He also wrote the book, The End of Jobs, which is about how the world of work is changing and what that means for people building their careers today. These days, he focuses on decision-making, risk, and helping investors to make smarter decisions through his work at Mutiny Fund. So in this episode, you're going to hear us talking about why Taylor decided not to go to law school and how that decision shaped his path. We talk about the illusion of safe careers and risks that people often overlook. We talk about how to think more clearly about long-term decisions and a bunch of different decision-making frameworks that you can use, as well as what investing has taught Taylor about risk and resilience. And finally, why trying to avoid risk completely can actually be the most dangerous thing you can do. And that part you're gonna love, so stick with this till the end. You can get the full show notes, the transcript, and read my newsletter at theknowledge.io. And you can find Taylor online on Twitter at TaylorPearsonMe. And you can check out his website, which is taylorpearson.me. But also he has a really great newsletter that I personally read. I got a really good idea from it. He shares a few links. I think it's called The Interesting Times. I've been subscribed for a while. Taylor is someone who I've read his blog for a very long time. He's written a lot about risk. He's written about ergodicity. He's shared a lot of ideas from Nicholas Taleb from years and years ago. And so it was actually really great just to have this conversation with Taylor. And I really appreciated it. It's been good to keep in touch with him since. Like I say, I'm sure you're going to love this. If you do, please do share it with a friend. And don't forget to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because it helps us tremendously to find other listeners just like you. So I think one place I'd actually like to start is, so from hearing you speak about your background in the past, I heard that first of all, you majored in history, minored in Spanish, and you did some year abroad, and then I think you did a year abroad in Argentina, then you moved abroad for work. So before we get to that, because I also want to ask about your time abroad, I would love to know, you ended up going down, there's a chain of cascading events that led you to doing marketing, but it started with you not wanting to do law, and you were a history major, but you were thinking of going to law school. And I found your decision-making process here interesting. I'll let you talk about it, and then I'll ask the questions after.
Yeah, so I guess I wasn't particularly forward-thinking in college. I studied history because I liked it. I just picked the thing I most enjoyed. I took a bunch of classes my first year and the first half of my second year, and I liked history. I liked writing papers. I mean, mostly, right, you just read books and talked about them and then wrote papers about them, and I thought all of that was really fun. And I got to, I think it was the sort of summer after my junior year before starting my final year, and kind of the default path, certainly at my college, I think this is probably true in the US broadly for the most part, is like if you do a history undergrad, like law school is a very common path. After that, I think there was like 17. I went to a small school. I think there were 17 history majors my senior year. And I think 13 probably went to law school or something like that. Like that was kind of like by far the most common thing. And I'm curious what I've said in the past about my decision-making framework. I think I just wasn't excited about it. I think that's where I got to. And it wasn't that risky to like not do it for a year and think about it and like go back and take the test or whatever. And so my parents thought I was like just about to go to law school every year for like 5 years after I graduated college, that I would go back. I think most of what I recall thinking about it was I just like wasn't excited about it. And, the way the sort of US university system evolved, like there was like a substantial amount of debt that I was going to need to take on to do law school. So like if I did it and didn't like it, it was like really hard to get off the path and do something else. And so, yeah, I just kept delaying it. And then eventually, I don't know, I got to a certain point where I delayed it so long and I had other opportunities and it was no longer something I was thinking about.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that's what you said is exactly it. But the thing that I'm interested in is, first of all, loads of people go into law degrees. It's the exact same here in the UK. And I know from lots of people in the US, people end up going and doing law or doing medicine. But what I find interesting about what you said, and knowing that you have now spent a lot of time thinking about decision making frameworks and a lot of these other things, I'd be interested to know how you think about that same decision. Maybe aside from the fact that you already knew you perhaps weren't super interested in it. But the key part I'm thinking of is the fact that a lot of people probably rationalize themselves into doing in law or medicine or some similar degrees simply because the way the kind of mental model works is that the expected value is quite high in a sense, where you probably eat dirt for a few years. You're not earning that much, especially while you're doing law school. Everyone's poor. If you're in medical school, you're going to be poor for a number of years. And then suddenly your pay skyrockets and you're doing extremely well. And then now you're in a very high paying career. And in some of those years, then you just suddenly very quite quickly pay off the debt that you incurred along the way. And I think a lot of people have that framework in mind, and that's how they rationalize themselves into making the exact same decision that you decided not to do. And people just think, because doing some other degrees, you could also rack up a lot of debt for something else that doesn't pay well in the end anyway.
I don't know if I had like the presence of mind. I don't know if I thought this at the time, but I think certainly one lesson I take from that is like the options that are available to you are like not necessarily all the options. I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee. I went to like a small, not particularly notable school in the Southeast US. And most people from that school went into accounting, legal, I guess, somewhat standard sort of corporate, like working at Wells Fargo, like, kind of that sort of trajectory. And so like, that's kind of what I thought, like, I don't know, like that was just what you did, right? That's just like kind of what I saw people doing. And so I think the first thing I was like, I'm going to take some time and think about, like, do a little exploration and like see what more is going on there. And then I think I made a decision like pretty early on in my life to like, I wouldn't have framed it in these terms, but like not view myself as like homo economicus, like an economic agent, right? Like, oh, I do this and this is trajectory and this is the payoff, right? Because like Paul Graham, one of the Y Combinator founders and writer, has an essay about wealth, and like one of the lines is like, wealth is what you want, right? So like if you had a magic machine and you just told that machine what you wanted and it gave it to you, you would have no use for money. Like a dollar, whatever, it would be useless to you, right? You would just tell the machine what you wanted, whatever you wanted, and the machine would produce that sort of thing. So I think my goal was always to find something where I could do good enough financially, with what good enough meant changing over time. But like I've always put like a reasonable emphasis on like trying to enjoy my day to day work and career. I think everyone has certain parts of their work. I'm not blissful all day, every day at work. And I think if I'm going like 6 months and I'm like really sort of miserable at work, like something has to change here. And if that's like economically to my detriment, then I try to figure out a way to make that work.
Yeah, sure. What scares a lot of people is essentially it's just risk, different flavors of risk. And I think perhaps we'll talk a bit about abstractions and heuristics and later, but very often people kind of get onto a path. We both know Paul Millard, who has the book The Pathless Path, and this idea of there is a track that you could very easily go on that leads you through university, and then you do this job, then you do that job, and life could all be so simple. And straying off of that path opens you up to tremendous risk, perhaps. Well, that's what it seems to be. But I've heard you talk about this idea of simultaneously there's a silent risk of perhaps doing the expected or staying in a job too long.
So I think one of the writers who was very influential on me early on was Nassim Taleb. He has a number of books: Fooled by Randomness, The Black Swan, Anti-Fragile. Fooled by Randomness, I think, is the best. It's his first book, and I think the most straightforward introduction to his work. But he has this fun graph of the lifespan of a turkey. And so, like, of course, like the American tradition is like on Thanksgiving, everyone eats a turkey, right? And so, if you are a turkey, he shows this little graphic, and it's a turkey standing in front of a whiteboard, and he's got this big chart behind him. And every day the turkey's life gets better, right? So the farmer comes out and he puts the food in the trough, and the turkey eats the food and then whatever, waddles around with his friends, and it's great. Life as a turkey is great, right? He's pointing to this chart and it's just going up and to the right, right? Everything's getting better all the days the turkey comes in. And then, of course, Thanksgiving morning, the turkey's life is not so good. All of a sudden, everything goes bad. And, his point is there's lots of things where like you don't necessarily get like a warning sign, right? It's not like things start to slowly decline. It's like things are good, then things are bad. And it just changes very quickly. And so I think, talking about risk, I think that's an important concept of not, yeah, I think I use the term silent risk, which is like actually after my book, The End of Jobs came out, I had a guy reach out to me that I talked to a lot that was really interesting. He had worked at IBM for I think 30 years, a long time, 20, 30 years or something. IBM for some period of time, I think they called it like a lifetime employment policy, but they basically said, we'll never fire you. Like you started IBM, I think, you started IBM at 22 or something, straight out of university. And, at a certain point that changed. He got laid off. I think he was in his 50s. He was around his like peak earning years. And he was in a really tough spot because a lot of his like career value and career knowledge was he understood a lot of really specific things about working at IBM that weren't very transferable to another company, right? It was how the hierarchy worked at IBM or certain IBM products or how to manage things politically or certain coworkers, relationships, all that kind of stuff. And so he'd had to sort of go through this multi-year process of sort of reinventing himself and coming up with a new career and trying to figure things out. And so I think that's a lot of stuff when people talk about, oh, this is the safe path or this is the safe trajectory. I think it's like, what depends on what your definition of safe is and like what is safe really, right? So like pointing to this thing has worked for the last 10 years. Okay, that's a data point, but like, can we necessarily say like that's safe per se? And I think, yeah, I mean, I think that's the case with like a lot of jobs. I know there's been like the US tech sector's had quite a few layoffs, and like most people in those layoffs, I don't think saw it coming, right? They weren't sitting there going, I'm probably going to get laid off 12 months from now, right? They thought, oh, this is great. I've got this great job. Everything's going well. And it's, maybe I'm not happy, but at least it's safe kind of thing. And so I think I challenge that with a lot of people because I think, especially if you love it and you're super passionate about it and it's the thing you want to spend your life on, like that's great. Maybe it is risky, but good for you. And if that makes sense, given everything else you're doing in life, that's awesome. Like a lot of times the safety thing, it's like a way of sort of saying like, I'm afraid or I'm worried. And instead of like talking about that directly, you're just sort of like appealing to this notion of safety that like may or may not exist.
I think what you were saying just now, well, just a moment ago about IBM made me think of when I spent some time a while ago working in China, working in Shanghai. And a friend of mine was telling me that I think a lot of young Chinese people, probably getting into their mid 20s, by probably about 25, people start having existential crises because there are so many people. There are lots of jobs, but there's also a lot of people. And so whatever job you're doing, by the time you're 25, at least this is how people think about it, that's going to be the job for the rest of your life. And, in Japan, for example, they won't fire you there either. And so it's not like you're going to lose your job, but it also doesn't mean you can switch jobs. So it's almost the inverse risk of like, once you pick a path, you're stuck on that path. And that's actually going to be it. It's not even like you have the option to switch paths. But just on what you were saying about just the idea of risk and how people can either the perceived risk that they see is too high or they just don't fully appreciate the value of risk. I think this links to another thing that I've heard you mention in the past, but I think is also from Nassim Taleb, which is this idea that I think the analogy that Nassim Taleb used was, it's links to ergodicity, and it's the idea that jumping off a 1-foot wall 50 times is not the same as jumping off a 50-foot wall one time. And the way I think about it as well, something that came to my mind, I think in the last week or so, I was at the train station, and you've been to London, you came last year. Sometimes on the London Underground, you will see there's going to be the escalators, but there'll also be the stairs, and they put a warning on the stairs and they tell you exactly how many stairs they are, especially if it's going to be long. So they'll say this stairwell has X number of stairs, just because you can't see it before you start taking the stairs. And that warning has to be there so people know exactly what they're signing up for once they start taking the stairs. But I think the funny thing is that when you have to take the stairs in an emergency, people obviously end up hating it. But a big part of that reason is because people don't do the small, harsh thing that you could do every day, which is taking the stairs. And so when you're forced to do a much bigger, hard thing, it feels so much worse. And I think in that same process, people take away the wrong lesson. So every day, people avoid taking the stairs, even though incrementally, like just day to day, it's not that bad. You could take the stairs on a normal day, but people will avoid the small inconvenience of taking the stairs on a regular day. And then on the one day that you're actually forced to take the stairs, it feels like the worst thing in the world. And then once you do that, you're like, oh, I'm not going to do that again. And so from that point on, then you continue to avoid the stairs. Whereas if you took the stairs regularly on a normal day, just small stairs, then by the time, if there's an emergency, there's a fire drill, or you actually are required to use the stairs, then, it feels relatively easier.
Yeah, I like that example. And I think of like, I have no data whatsoever to support this, but just like total anecdotal observation. Like I meet some people that have, talked to some people that are very intelligent people that have worked at like large companies for long periods of time. And, in a certain way, they just by necessity, right? Like you're working at Amazon or something, like your whole job is like 2 pages, managing 2 pages on like the Seller Central dashboard or whatever. A lot of that just like isn't very transferable to like other things, right? Like it's just extremely specific to that particular company. And so I think there's a lot of situations like that where like to me, I think I can make a reasonable case that that's like quite a risky thing to do, right? As you said, if you start your career, you work for something like at a small company or a startup or freelance or whatever, like the skills you get there tend to be a lot more generalizable, right? The equivalent of like jumping off one stair 50 times and like applicable to a lot of other situations in a way that certain big companies I'm thinking of, you get sort of like put in this really niche specific thing that's just like not particularly transferable. And like that's a risky thing, right? Because like your economic value, right? Like maybe you're making a really great salary, like your economic value is very tied to like this particular thing, right? Like one product on Amazon Web Services, whatever the thing you're doing is. So I think like from my view, it's like the important thing is like it's not necessarily a bad thing, right? If you enjoy it or you make a ton of money, whatever, great, good for you. But like let's not say that this is like necessarily safe or smart or robust. This is like a risky thing that you're doing and you're sort of comfortable with that risk. I don't think that doesn't tend to be how people think about it, right? They tend to think about that's like the smart, safe thing to do and something where you're going to work at a smaller company or start your own thing or whatever it is a lot more risky. And I don't think that's like a really reasonable assessment of like career risk, right? That like having a broad experience of generalizable and transferable skills feels to me like that's like a much less risky thing to do, right? That your ability to turn that do other things with that is much higher.
Yeah. But what I find interesting about that, though, is I feel like I can see both sides. And the irony is that most people don't. And that's why they stay stuck. So the end question I want to ask you is, how you think people can functionally escape the sunk cost of whatever position they're stuck in or whatever role they're doing. But I think, just going off the back of what you were saying, I spent about 5 years in corporate law. And I definitely think that people severely underestimate how transferable some of the skills they're learning are, or at least how powerful some of the skills they were learning are, if they applied them to other domains. But the problem is they are applying that exact same skill set to the exact same domain over and over again and just optimizing for getting better at that. Whereas if you took some of those skills and you applied them somewhere else, actually you would realize these feel like superpowers. And I guess the analogy that I would give is that it's a bit like thinking that you have superpowers because you get really good at cultivating spiders instead of letting the spider bite you and then you get to become Spider-Man. Like if you took that little bit of risk of letting the spider bite you, the asymmetry of a future where you're Spider-Man is far greater than being the person that gets to grow the spiders. But you still have the same proximity to that, the potential of having that alternate timeline. I know that probably sounds a little bit complicated, but that's kind of the way I think about it, where,
I love a
the
good
skills that
Spider-Man
I learned.
analogy.
But yeah, go on.
No, I think there's I don't know, it's interesting, like, I've hired people, like, directly out of college, like, there are, like, a lot of work skill like, how to write an email, you know what I mean, is, like, an underrated and important work skill, like, it's, like, a surprisingly non-obvious thing to do or, like, yeah, how to manage your calendar and stuff like it, which, like, it sounds, like, kind of pedantic, but, like, it's actually not pedantic, like, if you're, like, good at responding to your email and showing up at appointments on times, that's pretty good, you can do a lot with that. I don't know. I'm always like there's a bit of this like lionization of entrepreneurship in the culture at the moment, and I'm always like really hesitant. I'm always hesitant about like sort of not playing into that kind of thing. And I think one thing else, like most people, this is again my sort of experience. Like most people that have like been successful, like working their way up some like competitive corporate career, spinning that into starting a business or working in a smaller company, like just a general like grit, competence, raw intelligence, all those filters, like you've kind of probably passed through all those filters. at that point, and like your ability to make that switch, in my experience, is like pretty good. I think there's usually like a, I don't know, 3-year transition period, or there is some transition period of like figuring that out kind of thing. But no, I think that's right. Like there is a certain transferability there. I don't know. I'm curious what you think. Like it seems like maybe the later you wait, it gets a little bit harder, especially like given earning expectations. You know, if you're at like 45 or 50 at sort of peak earning years and like trying to do that and get back to peak earning in a new career, that seems like it might be a little bit harder, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And that's where all my friends are stuck. I think that's the thing, right? Okay. So it's both in terms of your compensation and both in terms of the skill set. If you stay long enough just to pick up the skills and then you can take them and apply them elsewhere, I think that's the peak option. Well, that's what I did. I think that's the peak option. We will see. Right now, I am still very much feeling jealous of some of my friends who will be listening to this that are still at the firm that I was at, who are earning, very well, and a lot of people from my cohort. But I think the thing is that the longer you stay, just applying the same skill set to the same problem, it almost starts to diminish. I think the potential upside diminishes because then you get trained too much to apply it very narrowly and you don't know it anymore how to apply that skill set broadly. And then on top of that, that's compounded by the compensation that you get. So then the benefit that you could potentially get by leaving and actually trying to, because it does necessitate starting from the bottom a bit, taking that skill set and moving it elsewhere, you do have to learn and you have to start pattern matching. And that requires, yeah, there is the emotional risk there of actually having to, it takes some humility, it takes some, you have to put yourself out there to learn in other domains.
One thing I've been thinking a lot about lately is like the idea of like a personal balance sheet, right? So like a business will have a balance sheet that like shows all its assets, right? It owns a factory and a car and whatever, and it has this much cash in the bank and like those sorts of things. Or like a person has a balance sheet too, and you can like think of that in strictly financial terms. You have whatever money you have in the bank, and you have a car and whatever you own and that kind of stuff. But like I think there's like two other ways to like broaden the concept of balance sheet that are interesting. One is thinking about like, as you said, like human capital, right? So like if you're learning very fast, right, you're acquiring a lot of new knowledge, hopefully that's like somewhat transferable. Like even if you're not making that much money, like you could factor that into the balance sheet too, right? Like, okay, maybe I didn't make that much money over this period, or I made a lot of money and I learned a lot of skills. Okay, that's really interesting, right? But I think how I'm interpreting what you're saying, right, is like you also get in these periods where like maybe you're earning a lot of money, but like the human capital part of your, so like the financial balance sheet looks good, but at a certain point, maybe the human capital side of the balance sheet isn't that much more interesting than it was 5 years earlier, or isn't that much more compelling than it is 5 years earlier. And like there's a cost associated with that. All right. That's a trade-off that's being made. Maybe I think a lot of people don't think about explicitly. And I think you can even broaden the concept more and say there's also like, how you feel about your life that's like part of that balance sheet, right? Like, is it whatever? Am I enjoying what I'm doing? Is this meaningful to me? Like all those sorts of like existential questions start to come in. And so I think it's like I think about that a lot. I think one sort of interesting investing analogy is if you're investing in a company, people often do something what's called a discounted cash flow analysis, right? So you'll try and project out the cash flows of the company and its earnings and its costs, and all this kind of stuff, and what the profits can be. And you'll work backwards from that to determine like what an appropriate valuation is today, right? What I'm willing to pay for this company. And like one of the biggest variables in that calculation is how long you expect those earnings to persist for, right? So if you have a company that's making a lot of money, but doesn't have much of a competitive advantage and those earnings go away in 3 years, the present value is a lot less than a company that has pretty good profits, but has a very durable competitive advantage and can last over a long time. And so I think, in principle, that's true of an individual as well, right? It's like if you do something where it's reasonably valuable and you're reasonably good at it and you can do it for a reasonably long time on your, discounted cash flow analysis, it's actually worth a lot because it can persist over a long period of time. I think some people get, folks say like, oh, I can make a lot of money doing this for the next year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, whatever. But actually, maybe it's better to think about what could I do for the next 20 years, or what would that look to think in that time frame, and like what would that look like and how would I do things differently?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm going to mix analogies here, but the way I'm thinking about it in my mind is okay, so on one hand, it's a bit like the 80-20 of in most jobs and in most careers, you spend 80% of the time getting good and then 20% of the time getting great. But you have to get good first. And once you get good, that you've got the 80% and the 20% is just optimizing. And so the other way of thinking about it is getting good at the skill and getting good at the game. The skill is the 80%, but that is just onboarding, slightly beyond onboarding, but like getting to a point where you are competent and you're good enough to be dangerous. That is the 80%, and then the 20% is the game. So first you get good at the skill, then you get good at the game. But the problem is that the actual time allocation is the inverse of that. So how long does it take to get the 80%? 20% of the time. And then you spend 80% of the time on the remaining 20%, and that is the rest of the career. And so using law as an analogy, but it applies to other careers as well, is that people within the first few years of being in that career, you do the 80%, you get good at the skill. And then the rest of the entire time span of that career is like working your way up to partner. That's getting good at the game. That's the only 20%. And so I think that's the part where, in your analogy, that goes on the other side of the balance sheet where you're not actually building the skill anymore in terms of the human capital. You are just optimizing for the game and just getting good at applying it within this very specific domain. And that is useful as long as you keep playing the game. That is super useful. But once you stop playing the game, you actually realize that you've spent however many years just optimizing for the final 20%. And the rest of that time, you haven't actually spent that developing on the other side of your skill set.
Right. No, I like that. That's very interesting. Right? At that point, your trajectory becomes very path dependent, right? You have to stay on that path and keep playing that game for it to sort of be successful in the long run. Yeah, I think there's a blogger I like. His name's Venkatesh Rao. He has a blog post. I think it's called The Compass and the Gyroscope, or that's the sort of analogy he uses. There's the idea of like an external versus an internal coordinate system, right? So like a compass is an external coordinate system. You have the north, south, east, west, and you look at a map and you sort of navigate it. And a gyroscope has sort of an internal system, right? It's rolling downhill. I'm not going to describe very well mechanically how a gyroscope works, but I think people can sort of visualize it. And I think about that analogy a lot too, because I think sort of to your point of like the skill versus the game is like, it's the more sort of like clear the map is in general, I think it's just like more competitive, right? Like getting to partner at a law firm or being a renowned surgeon in a particular, like it's really hard. It's just really, it's like being a professional athlete, right? Like what percentage of kids want to be a professional athlete when they're like teenagers? Like it's really hard. And so this idea of like a gyroscope, or maybe you're picking up some skills here and some skills there, you're sort of following an internal coordinate system that's not leading down a necessarily known map or known road. I think it's Paul's like pathless path idea, but does still have a certain logic to it, right? Things do stitch together in a certain way in which those skills are complementary and useful. They are not in a way that is easily explained to someone on the outside in the same way that you made partner to a law firm, or you went to good law school, or you did this for that sort of specific accomplishment.
Yeah. So I'm interested to apply this too. Going back to your career path. So after you left college, I think you spent some time working abroad, and you mentioned that, or maybe this was, I think, actually before that, in your second year of college, you had a year abroad, and then coming back, you had like a reverse culture shock that made you want to go back out again. And I'd love to know more about how you felt in that moment and what felt like the most impactful. Like, what did you see that felt, I don't know, life-changing or paradigm shifting, that you then came back and felt like, something's different, something's missing?
I think for me, that experience, yeah, I did. It was my third year, my junior year. I spent a year in Argentina. I was a Spanish minor, and my Spanish was not very good. And so I thought if I went and spent a year in Argentina, my Spanish would have to get good. I lived with like a host family, like an older woman. I lived in like the spare bedroom in her house and went to the university there. And I think, yeah, that was impactful for two reasons. I think one, when I got there, my Spanish was really bad, like really bad. Like, I don't know. I can't stress how bad it was, embarrassingly bad. And the first, depressed is a strong term, but like the first month or two were like really hard. Like my classes were in Spanish. It's like, imagine if, but I didn't speak any Russian, you're like sitting down in a Russian university and like, I literally didn't know what they were saying. You know what I mean? Like literally, I couldn't understand the words that were coming out of their mouth. And yes, it was really tough. And so I would like go home with my like host mother, and I would like sit there with like my Spanish English dictionary open and like try and talk to her, and I'm like looking up words, and like we're pointing, she's pointing at stuff and she's telling me what the word, like, like I'm a 4-year-old basically, right? Like a young child. And by the end of it, I don't know, my Spanish was decent. Like I was conversationally functional, but like I could like go to a university class and like in Spanish and like get, 98% of what they were saying and be a functional thing. And so I think that was just like a huge confidence boost for me that I had done this hard thing, that I was clearly very bad when I showed up and I was like reasonably competent when I left. And so I think that gave me like a lot of courage to like try something else, you know, to do something a little bit different and not necessarily go to law school or kind of go down the default trajectory. And I think the other thing relates back to what I said earlier, which is just like it was a different experience in like ways I couldn't have imagined, right? There's, you know, you talk about like there's the known knowns and the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns, right? So this was it was an unknown unknown, right? It was different culturally, historically, sort of all those different components in ways I hadn't even really thought about. And so I think that gave me a certain like maybe there's other things I haven't thought about that are different about how the world works. Like I wanted to explore that some. And so I think, yeah, I wanted to go live abroad again after that, just because that, for me at that point, like that was one way in which that was very visceral, just living in a different culture, people speaking a different language, and like seeing what that was like.
Yeah, sure. That reminds me a bit of, like I mentioned, I went to China as well, and it was a very similar experience. Although I had studied Chinese a bit, and that was kind of the point. So originally, actually, before going to university, my original plan was I wanted to go and work at a Chinese university. I got like 2 offers through my Chinese teacher to go and, you know, teach English at a university there. And my dad said no, so I didn't get to do it. But but then during university, then I had an opportunity to go. I was actually working at a law firm there, so to connect two of our lines. But in the first month, I was doing half days, so I would go to work for the first half of the day, and then go to language school for the second half of the day. And at the language school, they did not speak English; they would only speak to you in Chinese. And then at work, obviously, people are only speaking in Chinese, and it was so hard. Particularly that first month was just grueling because, you know, people also like culturally, they would have lunch together at work. And so, yeah, first of all, I didn't even know how to use chopsticks. So I had to learn that in front of everyone. So it's like hugely embarrassing. Everyone's sitting around this big table having lunch together, and I'm trying to figure it out. It actually took a while. And then going from there to language school where they're only going to speak to you in Chinese, but you actually get better quite quickly. And I remembered one situation because you mentioned Russian. They sent me to go and meet with some guys. Obviously, the whole point I'm there is because I speak English, right? And so I'm meant to be really good at English. That's how I got the job. I had some of the best exam grades in the world at English. And so they sent me to go and meet these, you know, white people. They were from Russia. And the joke was when I actually got there to meet them, they did not speak English. They spoke Russian and they also spoke Chinese. And so, and so the only language I could speak to them in was Chinese because I was, you know, I'd been learning Chinese. This guy spoke Chinese and also Russian. I know no Russian. And so I was just stuck there trying to figure out how to negotiate things. But the other thing, how I was going to tie that back was you had mentioned this idea that I think also connects to something we were talking about, which is when you go to a new place, you kind of get to try out some different versions of yourself, right? You are unconstrained by your typical environment. People usually know you as one person and in one way. And when you move somewhere else, you get to, not that you have to be different, but you get to try to be different. You get to be a bit more explorative and you can push some of the boundaries that you might typically be stuck within. And it was funny, there was a post that I came across on Reddit that was reshared on Twitter. So unfortunately, the person that shared it didn't get to see the revelation that occurred. But the person that was making the post was talking about his life, and basically he was miserable, right? He had this job washing dishes, working early hours of the morning. He was just working in this restaurant, washing dishes. It wasn't fun. He was arguing with his girlfriend all the time. I think they'd recently broken up. He had these friends that he wasn't really friends with them anymore, and they've kind of disconnected, and none of them were really doing anything well either. He'd been trying to save some money to move, but not enough that he hadn't saved enough to move. He'd saved enough. What he did was he stopped renting the apartment he was renting. He got a van. He was living in the van and he managed to save about 15,000, but he didn't feel like he'd saved enough to move. And the comment that I saw, which was now on Twitter where this post had been reshared, is that this guy is completely miserable. But how happy would he be if someone whacked him over the head and he completely forgot everything about his current life? All the constraints that he sees, to the girlfriend that he argues with, the job that he's supposed to show up at. If he didn't know he had to show up at that job, he just woke up with no memories like Jason Bourne. He has a van that he could stay in. He has $15,000 in the bank. Like, that is actually a pretty great fresh start, you know? If you didn't know anything else and you have $15,000, you've got a van, you've got some clothes, some belongings. That's actually a much better position to be in than a lot of people. But when you're stuck in that position, you can't really see that. Like you can't climb out of the situation that you're already in to see things with fresh eyes.
And I think that's hard for me. That's been perpetually hard, right? You just don't. I think there's a David Foster Wallace bit where he's talking about there's two fish swimming. They're like just swimming at each other, and they swim past each other in the water. And one fish turns to the other fish and goes, "Water's nice today." And the other fish looks back and goes, "What the fuck is water?" Right? It's like, well, it's a fish. Why water is nothing, right? It's like, why would you even comment on it? You're in water all the time, right? I think it's hard to see those things and see like, oh, this is water.
Yeah, so in The End of Jobs, your book, you talk about this idea of developing skill stacks and, using that as a way of traversing through the working world. And I think, well, a big part of the emphasis of your book was becoming more entrepreneurial and kind of using the skills that you developed to become more entrepreneurial. I would love to know about your personal skill stack because you've had a really interesting background. And I think, so maybe there's two layers of the question. The first layer is, how do you think you've gone about building your skill stack? Is there any way that you've thought about learning things in particular that you found useful? Just because, I mean, like tracking some of the things you've been interested in. First of all, okay, starting with majoring in history, minoring in Spanish, getting into marketing and learning all the skills you need to get there without going through any real formal process. You kind of did that very manually. Going from there to becoming a writer, both publishing your book and also writing quite prolifically online. Then going from there to being an investor. I think at one point you got interested in complexity studies. You seem to have taught yourself a lot of things along that path. So I'd love to hear you talk a bit more about that.
Yes, let me see if I can answer sort of both levels of the question at the same time. I think there's a paper I wrote a summary of some years ago. It's called Optimize for Interesting. I think that the guy that wrote it, I believe, was an AI researcher. And if you think about why emotions exist, right? It's like, why does the emotion of interesting exist? Why do you get interested in something, right? Like, why is that? Why evolutionarily, psychologically, like, why would we develop the emotion of interesting? And his theory was basically something that is interesting is an area in which you have a great capacity for what he calls compression progress. So your ability to like take the different components of that and compress it with your existing knowledge and like make something, more efficient and useful and interesting is higher. And that's why the emotion interesting exists, because it would make sense evolutionarily that you want to pursue these things which you find interesting because it's an emotion that's indicating sort of a fruitful way to take your skill stack, as you described it. And so I think that's always sort of been the way I've tried to think about it is like, okay, what am I doing now? And like, what is interesting that is like somewhat adjacent to that? And like, that's going to kind of I'm going to spend my free time. That's what I'm reading about. That's what I'm interested in. That's what I'm looking at. And even though it's not directly applicable to maybe what I'm doing now, it's interesting to me. And so I'm just going to sort of take it on some faith that there's some ability for compression progress, that there's something I can do in that direction. So I guess sort of my career progression. My first job was I was a Spanish interpreter. And that was my one marketable skill coming out of university. I took a night class my senior year to get, I don't know if I was officially licensed. I had some badge or something, but I was doing interpretation. So I did that. It's like that was sort of my first freelance gig. And then I got a job as an English teacher in Brazil. I said I wanted to go abroad again. And so I moved to Brazil and I taught English for a while. I didn't love teaching English for a number of reasons. And so I had gotten interested in digital marketing. And I just think this was sort of early 2010s and like search engine optimization, all this stuff was kind of coming online. I went to Amazon and I bought every book on search engine optimization at the time, which I think there were 3 books. I think there's probably 30,000 of them now. And I built some websites, basically teaching myself SEO. I think my most successful website was collegefurniture.net. And it was like reviews of like furniture you would use at college. So like futon reviews and nightstand reviews, whatever. And I think at its peak, I think I made like $300 a month or something. And I was like pretty jazzed about my $300 a month from the site. But that sort of set me on like my initial career trajectory. I was able to parlay that. $300 a month wasn't sustainable. So when I left my English teaching job, I got a job in a marketing agency, and I cold emailed a bunch of marketing agencies and said, hey, look, I know SEO. Here's my website. Here's all the SEO stuff I did. Will you give me a part-time job? And so I got a part-time job, and that turned into a full-time job. I worked there for a while. I started doing, sort of other digital marketing adjacent things, email marketing, pay-per-click, a bunch of stuff like that. That got turned into, I got a job at an e-commerce company that was based between some in California, some in East Asia. We had a team in like the Philippines and Vietnam and China. And so I moved out. I was in Vietnam for a couple of years working for them. And I sort of progressed from just doing marketing. They had a number of different hospitality equipment brands. So we sold like parking equipment, bar equipment, stuff like that. And I ended up running one of those brands. And so I kind of got out of marketing. I was doing more operational stuff. I was kind of overseeing the whole brand and sort of not just the marketing piece of it. And then that company got sold. And at that point is when I sort of wrote my book, The End of Jobs, and started doing basically consulting, freelancing stuff around that, sort of e-commerce marketing and e-commerce operation stuff. And at that time, I just got like really interested in finance. So I just started like reading like a bunch of finance books. I was doing like a little bit of investing, like nothing particularly crazy. I got very interested in the cryptocurrency, Bitcoin stuff. I thought that was very fascinating as like a blend of technology and finance. And so sort of my consulting progressed to be a little bit more focused around financial services companies, that sort of industry. And sort of in that process, I met my now business partner, who was a trader by background or a finance person by background, and we started a small fund. So that's what I sort of run day to day now. But the trajectory there's a certain linearity to me looking back. I think sort of, as you mentioned, some of these ideas around like complexity and anti-fragility have always been really interesting to me. And I've in different areas thought about how those things apply, but I felt was always sort of on this trajectory of like kind of what's interesting and how can I sort of incorporate that more into what I'm doing.
What was the process like of publishing The End of Jobs?
So the self-publishing, I know we've had Eric Jorgensen on the podcast, who's the CEO of Scribe now. So I was one of Scribe's very early customers. I don't know how early I was, but it was before it was called Scribe. They had a previous name. So when I published the book, I've always enjoyed writing. I liked history. I started blogging when I was at my e-commerce job, kind of on the side. And so that was kind of what enabled me. That was like my Saturday project for like 3 or 4 years. I would wake up Saturday morning and I would go to a coffee shop and I was like working on my blog. And that was, I guess, people work on newsletters now, not blogs, but kind of same concept. So I had a blog and I had done a fair amount of writing about these ideas of just like future of work and how the internet was affecting careers. And, it was at some level just sort of like a reflection on my own career, my own path, right? Like how did I sort of end up in what was very different from sort of a law school trajectory? That was like a brand manager at an e-commerce company in Vietnam, right? It's just it was a very different trajectory than sort of like where I'd expected to be if you'd asked me 5 years earlier. And so, yeah, I just decided it would be cool to like write a book. I'd written a lot about it. And so I was like, I'll kind of take these things and I'll stitch them together into a book. Yeah, I was very fortunate. I had like some friends that helped me promote it and it got a bit of traction and did a lot better than I expected, honestly. And I really enjoyed it. I liked writing. So it was painful at times, but overall enjoyable.
Hey, we'll get back to the episode in just one moment, but I wanted to tell you very quickly about my newsletter. I started sharing everything I was learning online, and a few thousand people came along for the ride. I send 3 regular emails. Brainwave, fortnightly on a Tuesday, which is about the intersection between technology, philosophy, and psychology. Then every week on a Thursday, I send Revelations, and that's about creativity and productivity. And then finally, every other weekend, I send Wayfinder, and that's about decision making. So people in the audience actually send me really tough problems that they're working through, and I help to deconstruct them using mental models and decision-making frameworks. So if you'd like to subscribe, you can join me and over 20,000 incredibly driven people at theknowledge.io. Okay, back to the episode. If you were to write an update to the book now, what beliefs would you update? So what's changed in your thinking from what you previously wrote, or is there anything new that you've learned since?
I have like a whole chapter like railing on accountants. And a month before I published the book, I met my now wife, who's an accountant. So I would probably change that chapter. Is one major update I would make. My views on the future of accounting have become more nuanced and sophisticated over time. Certainly, there's roles for good accountants in the future. The basic thesis of the book was basically like the internet opens up a lot of these new sort of like niche business opportunities that don't work in geographic worlds. One of the brands at the e-commerce company I worked for we sold like sort of like high-end boutique, well-designed cat furniture. It would be like your cat litter box would fit into like, it looked like a mid-century modern sort of side table, right? So you could like put it next to your nice mid-century modern couch and, the cat could go in and like use the litter box or whatever. And that business only makes sense on the internet, right? There's no geographic location where there's just a sufficient quantity of people that want to buy enough mid-century modern cat furniture to like make that a viable business, right? Like maybe New York or London or Tokyo, but it's not like the business works a lot better on the internet because across the world, there like are enough of those people, right, that have that particular design aesthetic and have a CAD and want their place to look nice or whatever. And I just thought that was like so fascinating. Like that was a viable, like that was a real business. Like it was a multiple six-figure business that could sustain a person, and it had a manufacturer and all that kind of stuff. And sort of through that process, I just met a lot of other people running similar types of businesses, right? That there were all these sort of, would kind of get called like long tail, if you will, businesses, relatively niche businesses that were economically viable in sort of the internet era. And yeah, I mean, I think broadly, like that's still true. Like there's still a lot of podcasting is certainly one thing that's exploded, right, in the last 10 years. Like the number of things there's podcasts for that like are real businesses now is like insane, right? Like all these really niche, there's a particular like college football team in the US that I like. It's like the team I grew up in. Like there's like people that like run a full-time job is like it's a podcast for people that are fans of this one college football team in the US, right? And there's there's 1,000 people that are willing to pay $10 a month to like hear the commentary about this team, right? Because they're super into it and they want to hear the latest of what's going on in the recruiting and that kind of stuff. So I think that sort of core thesis is intact. I think like the specific examples have probably like evolved some, like how those businesses get started and where you get into it, but I wouldn't like change a lot. Like I think sort of like core concepts are pretty decent and still work. I'd probably just sort of update it, take out the accounting stuff so I don't have to hear my wife tell me about how I was wrong about that.
Do you think AI changes much of what you were previously thinking about? I think of it in two ways. So one is going back to the turkey problem. There's a potential way in which, people give advice, oh, here's what you should do, here's the fields you should go into, etc. Loads of people are still, I think there was definitely a much bigger movement at one point of getting people into tech and saying, I remember people saying on the internet, plumbers are going to be dead. All these other careers will die out and everyone needs to start coding, code or die or whatever it was. And the irony is, it seems like that's probably one of the things AI is going to be best at is completely replacing a bunch of, especially the junior coders. And actually, I think this ties to a framework I've heard you mention, which is something along the lines of simple work, complicated work, and then complex work, where complicated is, I can't remember the precise words that you used, but complex work is kind of like heuristic work, where it's not so much just getting good at a certain skill set, but it's more thinking in an abstract way. And that seems to be what will survive. Whereas if you're doing something rote, something that can be taught, something that can be, you can essentially just train an AI to do. Hey, coding has a language. If it has a language similar to chess, chess has a fixed number of moves. If you can teach someone to do that, then you can teach an AI to do it. And maybe you don't have it as a job in the same way. And perhaps people will only do some of these things for entertainment purposes.
Yeah, I think the simple, complicated, complex is a good way to talk about it. So the idea is sort of a simple job or a simple system is something that can be broken down into like very clear, discrete steps. So like putting together a Lego set, right? Like you open the instruction manual, there's 42 steps of where you put the blocks on the certain Legos. You follow the steps. If you do it correctly, it looks like whatever, the boat or whatever it's designed to be. A complicated thing is something that tends to require some level of like expertise and experience. So I would say like, like a mechanic, for example, right? It's like you can try and fix your car just like following some instructions on YouTube. But like for a number of things, you probably want someone with some expertise. They can go like, well, if you take that off first, the bolt could fall down here and that causes this thing to explode, right? Like you need some sort of expertise, but ultimately, like there's a number of good enough answers, right? In a simple system, there's a correct answer. There's one best solution. In a complicated system, there's a discrete set of good answers, right? If your car is broken in a particular way, maybe there's 3 different ways you could fix it that are one's more expensive, but maybe last longer or whatever. A complex system is one in which you have emergent properties and there is no discrete set of good answers, that it's constantly evolving. So like sort of distinction between complicated and complex. The example I like is like the difference between like repairing a car and repairing a horse, right? So a car is a set of discrete parts, right? So you can take the tires off the car, put a new set of tires on. If you take the liver out of the horse, you cannot put the liver back in the horse, right? It all works together. It's all integrated. Once you take the liver out or you take the heart out, the horse is no longer functional. It all requires a sort of integrated system. I think it's an interesting way to think about work, right? Like you can say certain type of work, a given role or a given task that someone's doing, right? Like there are certain things they do on a day-to-day basis that are simple things, right? It's 4 steps. whatever, making my coffee in the morning. Like it's 4 discrete steps. There's a correct way to do it. There's a wrong way to do it. There's also complicated things I do that are, slightly more whatever. And then there's also complex things I do that there's not a clear right answer and it's hard to do. And sort of the way I talked about it in the book is, if you think of these things sort of as a pyramid, there are these two kinds of forces. One is globalization. I use the word machines. I debate on this a lot about, but like technology more broadly, I would sort of like lump AI into this thing. But these two forces of sort of globalization and machines that are kind of eating their way up the stack, right? And so like a lot of maybe the early stages of globalization was a lot of this simple work that got eaten by one of those two things effectively, right? That things got outsourced, they got moved overseas for a lot of people in developed countries, manufacturing from US to China, kind of that classical stuff, or it got automated. I did a tour of the Toyota production plant in San Antonio, Texas, right? And it's like, there's got about a lot of big machines, right? There's people there that are doing stuff as well. And like the people are important. They've automated a lot of that, like how that sort of production works. And so my thesis around, I think I might have used the term AI. I certainly wasn't like knowledgeable about AI to like make any sort of interesting predictions. But like to me, it's like a part of that machine group that is just like eating up that stack, right? So now I think a lot of things, software did a lot of simple things, right? Like if you can write a set of steps for this thing, the software can do those steps in a deterministic way. And AI, I think, is when it starts to get into that complicated stuff, right? That you can have things that require certain expertise and heuristic decision making. And, it seems plausible that the trajectory that AI is on will get to where it can do that kind of work, right? Like, I guess my sort of mental model for AI is like, it can like let anyone be mediocre at anything. If you've seen like AI write a history paper or whatever, like it writes a pretty good freshman, sophomore level history paper of the impact of Napoleon on Russian culture or whatever, right? Like it's like a pretty decent attempt at that. But it's not like really good, right? Like I don't like have ChatGPT write me an essay on like, right, something and like think like, oh, this is like really not. It's like, it's fine. It would probably get you, I don't know, a B or a C if you like turned it in and your teacher didn't know what it was or whatever. So I guess that's the way, when I talk about in the book, like becoming more entrepreneurial, like I think another way of saying that is like getting better at dealing with complex environments, emerging, things are changing fast. How do you do that kind of work? Because that is the thing that's what's scarce, right? That's what's hard to do for people. That's what's hard to do for machines. And so getting good at that is making yourself more valuable, I think, in the long run.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I think the other part that links to what you were saying that I think is interesting is, so Naval Ravikant has, I think at one point, essentially the quote from him is something like, there's two ways to make money, bundling and unbundling. And I think part of what made the internet age really great is that it unbundled so many things, right? In order to make money and for a business to be successful, it no longer needed to corner a market. You could make money, just like you were saying, in loads of niche ways. You could have your podcast in one corner of the world, which is just about one particular US football team or college football team. And you could have your business that sells mid-century modern cat furniture. Like you could do all of these very niche things because the internet allows you to find all of the people distributed around the world that make money doing that thing. And I think I heard someone else say something similar today, but I think he was just commenting on when people talk on the internet about how, okay, starting an e-commerce business, you can make millions and things like that. A lot of people think it's a scam. And a lot of people, I mean, there's definitely plenty of scams. So I'm not saying there's no scams. But I think the point is when you hear about, okay, all of these e-commerce businesses that are making 7, 8, 9 figures, it seems incredible. But it's because, okay, so I just finished reading a book called Flatland. I'm not sure if you've come across it. It's really good. I'd highly recommend it. It's an old book and it's a bit weird. It's basically just about a flat world that is 2-dimensional, and someone comes from a 3-dimensional world into the 2-dimensional world and explains to someone in that 2-dimensional world that there are other dimensions. So they take them up into the 3-dimensional world and they're like, whoa, you guys have spheres here, because in their world, everything is just flat, right? So things are just straight lines or things have points, but you can't really figure out that they're points because if you are actually flat, then you don't know how many sides a shape has. Anyway, it gets a bit complex. But the point is, it just made me think of that where when you think of the internet, what that allows you to do is go up another level. Because when you're in flat land and you can only see the world in one way, you think of things as local. And so when someone explains a business that makes a lot of money, you're thinking, oh, yeah, like within this local sphere, but actually the internet is up a level. and you can go down into, Japan and China, and you can make money in all places in the world. And so it's super easy to have a 7-figure business because it's so distributed. Like, it's not in one place. If it was in one place, it would be a very different type of business. But because you're able to come up into 3D land, you can make money from all around the world, and it's very different. So I went off on a bit of a tangent there, but bringing it back to AI, the thought that I had was there's a sense in which AI kind of rebundles things. Because before, for example, you would go to Google to search for text, you would go here to read something, you go to your library, or you'll go to blogs or research papers or wherever, then you go somewhere else to create images. Like, you would be multimodal in how you approached life, how you approach research, how you approach learning, how you approach entertainment. And there's a potential future where a lot of these things just coalesce, and actually OpenAI, or choose your tool of choice, they begin to aggregate a bunch of different services. And I think you're already starting to see that there's some AI tools that could generate characters, they can generate images, they can generate potential movies. And I wonder what happens when you no longer need to go to different websites, to different places to see what you need to see. Like, if you could just type and the entire film was generated on your laptop, like within the same screen, here's a film that you can watch. What does that do to, I don't know, to creativity, to entertainment, to books? So the things that you could be doing as an entrepreneur, I wonder how much of that gets eaten up by the AI. So all of that's on one side. And then on the other side is this idea that a lot of this comes at the price of our cognition. And I wonder what happens if you never need to, like, I think we've already lost one set of skills, which was, for example, mental maths. You don't need to learn to do mental maths if you have a calculator. And then what you currently use a calculator to do, if you just ask ChatGPT, what is this? What's the percentage of this? It's just going to tell you. You don't even need to learn that. And in a similar way, at least in our generation, you still have to do some research. Maybe you could use the internet for some of that research, but you don't have to go to the library and learn how to look for books. You could maybe do some research on the internet. You can look for web pages. What happens when you no longer need to learn to look for web pages? All you have to do is just type a search. So all of these different functions just coalesce into search function, and just being able to think of what you want is all that you need to be able to produce a vast amount of things. So I just wanted to know what you thought of the coming together of all of those ideas.
My wife and I like those, like every year Netflix has like 5 like sort of C grade Christmas rom-com movies where like the script feels like AI generated. Like, if it's not AI generated, it could totally, you know what I mean? It's like the same cliche plot line where you can like predict the thing or whatever. So whoever's producing those is screwed, because that for sure can be turned over to AI.
Yeah. The Hallmark
I've seen
industrial
that movie
complex.
5 times every year. Yeah, exactly. Hallmark better have some good AI engineers, because someone is coming for them. I think that's interesting. And you're talking about like the flatland thing, and I like the bundling and unbundling framing, because right, it captures a sense in which like nothing is novel, right? Or like we're just like recapitulating certain things. So it's like, in a certain sense, I think about, it's not that there's no local businesses on the internet, it's that the way you define local is different. Like, local might mean a forum or a subreddit, right? Like, that's the thing that happened. Like, in the ways someone would be well regarded in their local community of 5,000 people that was like in their neighborhood because they were a good plumber, right? That same phenomenon exists on the internet. It's just like you're a common poster on whatever, the personal finance subreddit, and you have helpful things to say about how people should do their budgeting, and you're a trusted and valuable member of that community, and that gives you access to certain opportunities that people will trust you and whatever. And then you have an online course that you sell about how to get your budget right, or you do some consulting, or you write a book or whatever. So I guess I have that like same intuition about the AI thing, is like it's just going to change sort of the definition of like what local means, or like how that works. Like, instead of being local, I think about like the cat furniture business. I tried to draw this image at one point. Maybe I could see if I could get an AI image of like, instead of like New York City, you have Amazon, right? And like you live on the outskirts of Amazon, and you're on the border of like Amazon and Google, right? And like that's how people find you through those two channels, and like that's the local place that you occupy on the internet. And instead of selling plumbing, you're selling instead of being a plumber, you're selling cat furniture, or sort of whatever it is. I guess that's the intuition I have, that like it bundles and unbundles in a different way. But yeah, I don't know, right? Again, I think like maybe a good answer to your question, like what would I change about the book now, is I think I probably overestimated the extent to which the internet would like remain like somewhat decentralized or like somewhat distributed. And I think, right, instead we've ended up with a bit more of like this walled garden phenomenon. Like if you like sci-fi, there's a book by Neil Stephenson called Snow Crash that was like, I think he coined the term metaverse in that book. It's like from the 90s. It sort of like imagines this future where it's like Ready Player One. If anyone's read that book, it's like sort of a conceptually similar book. It like imagines this future of like nation states have kind of collapsed, and you kind of have this like refeudalization. So I think the protagonist lives in, I think it's called like Mr. Lee's Greater Hong Kong, like now encompasses like the west coast of the US and like Vancouver, Canada, right? That's this sort of like new jurisdiction of like Greater Hong Kong. I don't know. I just thought that was like such an interesting concept, right? It's like we're just redrawing the lines here. We're sort of doing that's my intuition about AI is like it just sort of like redraws the lines in a different way. And like maybe it is something that's like a lot more centralized, right? Like maybe there's huge economies of scale to it because access to certain data sets, chip production, becomes, you can't make a good AI model without using one of four players, OpenAI, Google, Facebook, without having access to one of these four sort of players. And that, you end up in some different sort of jurisdiction. So that was a long-winded answer. I'm not sure like really got to the heart of your question, but the unbundling, bundling seems directionally correct way to think about it. Yeah.
Okay, tying this slightly back to what we talked about before, do you think it changes the heuristics that people might have? So, we talk about like navigating with compasses or gyroscopes, and the turkey problem of people typically may have had heuristics of this is the path that you go on, here is how you get a career, here's how you get a job. Do you think it changes anything about that process of how people find what kind of things to work on? So, for example, just using the example we just gave, maybe you don't think about, going and working at Hallmark right now. Maybe maybe you think of a different company or a different industry to work in. Do you think it changes any of that at all, or like any mental models that people might have for picking a career or picking a field?
I'm not sure I have a good answer to that. I think it's certainly worth thinking about. Douglas Adams, the author of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series, which is one of my favorite fiction series. He has like a great quote. It's something like, everything that exists in the world when you're born is normal and the way the world should be. Everything that's invented between the time you're 0 and 35 is new and exciting and you could build a career in. And everything that comes into the world after you're 35 is unnatural and against the way things should be and should be stopped. Or whatever. There's a lot of truth to that observation. Yeah, it's certainly worth thinking about like what extrapolate the AI thing outwards and like what is that? What does that look like? Like, I mean, I think one thing is like to our conversation earlier about like what is safe and what is not safe, right? Like you have certain careers that look safe or, may look safe to most people now that in fact aren't super safe, right? Because you're having this sort of changing landscape of what is valuable and like how the economy is structured. But I guess I think about through the same ones I mentioned earlier. It's sort of like the first wave of machines, technology, globalization sort of ate away at the sort of the simple type of work. Like I think AI, like it starts to eat away at the more complicated. They're like a junior coder is a good example, right? Or there's probably like lots of like junior legal professions, right? We think of like sort of mid-level or junior levels in like a lot of fields where like it's not as defensible as it used to be, right? Like, so I moved into like a older house and I'm like learning about home maintenance and all this kind of stuff. And like ChatGPT is awesome for that, right? Like I can get to like a 3 out of 10 plumber knowledge, like pretty fast. Does that make me a good plumber? No. Like, does that mean I'm like qualified to do something? But like, I can get a basic understanding. I can get to like mediocre at something like a lot faster than I used to be. That like first half of the learning curve, I think is a lot faster. But yeah, I'm not sure it like affects that much on the second half of the learning. You know what I mean? Like being truly exceptional at something feels as or more valuable as it used to.
Yeah, that makes sense. And actually, I'm very glad that we talked through this part because it's also helped me to solidify some of my thoughts on certain things. I think that some of the stickiest jobs will also be the ones with the highest risk asymmetry. It literally just came off the back of what you were saying. Okay, so thinking about law specifically, from when I worked in law, people were already talking about this is before we were talking about AI, but tech was already starting to be incorporated into law. And there were already these murmurings that, oh my gosh, some lawyers might be replaced by technology. And that seemed like nonsense to me and my reason why has changed from now. But at the time, it was because I worked at a firm where, we'd had a merger with a US firm, so now it was a much bigger firm. But the original version of that firm, we had people that I worked with so there was one guy, I think he was almost 80 or something, and he had been a trainee when so that's like a first or second year associate, when the first Star Wars film came out. And the person that he worked with, that he trained under, was also still at the firm. and the person that he trained was also still at the firm. Like you have like three generations of really old people that all one trained the next all at the same firm. And when they were first and second year associates, they didn't have email. There were no email, there were no computers, there were no typewriters. Secretaries used to write by hand what a partner dictated to them. So first of all, imagine how hard that job was. And then and then trying to get everyone trained on email or trained on typewriters first and then trained on email. And you think at some point, oh, you're not going to need all these secretaries. People are worrying about what's going to happen to trainees because, for example, I think trainees used to have to like write things out by hand or to copy documents. They would just type them out again. And that was how you made extra copies of documents that you needed to take with you. And you would think, oh, we're not going to need all these trainings. And now, before you would have like 2 or 3, now you have dozens. The same in the US, you have summer associates and you have first and second year associates. You have so many more of them because there's actually way more work for them to do. But I think the reason my thinking has changed, I still come to the same or similar conclusion, was just off the back of what you were saying, where I think it's just a function of risk. And it's the same reason right now people are still not accepting self-driving cars. If you drive your car and you kill someone, you can say sorry. And it's like, oh, at least there was a human that you can either forgive or hate for the rest of your life. If an AI is driving a car and kills your child, what do you do? Like the anger that you have nowhere to direct it. And I think that's a big reason why people hate it. And so it's the asymmetry function there where if the risk could involve AI killing someone, people are not necessarily going to be on board. And similarly with law, if the risk is your company's going to lose millions because this AI didn't think to check this other thing, good grief. Like the lawsuit for the first, law firm that tries to employ AI on something serious is going to be astronomical. I can't imagine being the partner that decides, oh yeah, we're going to take this risk, especially on something serious. And so I wonder how long it will take for some of these things to be sticky. Whereas if the risk, like plumbing, hey, I can just say what's going to happen. The risk is maybe I can't use the toilet for a little while. The risk is, okay, now I have to call a real plumber to come and do the thing that I just messed up. I made it even worse. So I think that's how some people might do the maths.
I use ChatGPT for writing stuff, and I find it's just like to your point about the bundling, unbundling, like there's just certain things. Like it's really good at like analogies, like helping. I'm trying to explain this concept, like throw out some analogies for me, or like I was trying to do something with like a sports metaphor, and I was like going back and forth with it, trying to come, and it was like great at that. But yes, it's certainly like I would never use it for something where I need to be like 99% confident, right? Like something where I'm with where 70% accuracy is sufficient. Great. That's fine. Like I'm going to do some sort of like brainstorming exercise, but that is about law for sure. It's like I have a ChatGPT bot that like have a little prompt in there for it to be a lawyer or whatever. And like, I'll talk to it or whatever. And it is useful for like me coming up, like before I have a call with a lawyer, I will come up with you know what I mean? Like I'll use it to like come up with the questions and get like be mediocre, be 3 out of 10 or whatever to like be able to participate in that call. I wouldn't like make a major financial decision on the basis of that thing.
Yeah, exactly. I think same. And I don't want this to turn into, we're just talking about law. Here is one, maybe to connect to your investing, which is probably one of the main things that you do now, running the Mutiny Fund. But there's an obvious tail risk that people talk a lot about with AI, which is that it's going to come and kill everyone. And so maybe not specifically to talk about that, but I would love to know how you think about tail risks in general, because I've heard you talk a little bit about the way that you do investments, but actually, maybe taking a step back from that, why would you even do investments by yourself? Why would you invest? There is a safe way potentially to do money where you just spread the risk out in a non-ergodic way across the entire market and you just say, hey, I'm just going to put all my money in ETFs. Why would you choose to do anything more complicated than that?
Yeah, so I think you've mentioned ergodicity a couple times, so maybe it's worth like talking about that because I think that sort of plays into what we're talking about with the career stuff and also the sort of investing stuff. So ergodicity is a term from physics, but the basic idea of ergodicity is when you have two scenarios. So one is, I'm going to use my own terms, not necessarily technical terms, but what you call like an ensemble average. And one is where you'd have what's like called like a time average. So you can think about it, does one person doing a repeated action over time get the same outcome as many people doing one action, right? So in the case, if you flip a coin, you have 100 people flip one coin and you count how many heads and tails there are. You have one person flip a coin 100 times. Statistically, it's going to work out to be the same distribution, right? You're going to have the same thing. If you have a scenario where the fun example is Russian roulette, if you have 6 people play Russian roulette once, as opposed to one person playing Russian roulette 6 times, you get a very different outcome, right? If 6 people play once, one person loses, 5 people win, and 5 people are very happy. If one person plays 6 times in a row, they're guaranteed to lose eventually. So in a not necessarily, a situation where the ensemble and the time average or path are not the same is said to be non-ergodic. And so it's interesting with respect to like careers and technology and paths and stuff, right? Because it's like just because it worked for someone else at another point in time doesn't necessarily mean it will work for you now, right? It depends what path and what trajectory you're on. But then I think also very interesting in finance and investing context, because you as an individual do not get the average returns of the market. You get what you get based on the path that you're on. So if you have a child that gets sick, if you need to support a parent, if you get laid off, if you want to start a business, right? You have all these sort of inflows and outflows that matter, impact the trajectory. So like, one example I give of this is like the Dow Jones Industrial Index from 1966 to 1997 returned on average 8% a year. But it did that in two very different ways. So the first part of that period, not remember these dates exactly, but let's call it like 66 to 82, it was basically flat. There were no returns. And for the second part of that period, let's call it 82 to 97, it had 15% a year returns, right? So it had 8% on average over this 30-year period. But the trajectory of those really matters, right? So if you are 65 years old and you retire at the start of that time period, you are drawing down that whole period, right? You're sort of spending your money. And so you don't get the average returns, because by the time the strong period of returns comes in, you've already withdrawn a lot of your wealth. If you do the inverse scenario, you get strong returns. So I don't remember these numbers off the top of my head, but something like, let's say a couple that retires with $3 million and they're planning to spend $180,000 a year in their retirement. If they get that bad period first, they go broke after like 12 or 13 years, right? Because their investments aren't appreciating and they're just drawing down on it. If they get the good period first, they get the strong returns, their retirement account grows a ton, right? They're only withdrawing a portion of it and it's going up 15%. It peaks at 12 million and their retirement savings last them for 70 years or something. And so sort of central to the way I think about investing is like, we don't know the future path of returns, right? Like we don't know what the trajectory of those are. We don't even know the average, but even if we did know the average, it's not enough to know the average. You also need to know sort of the sequence and the path. So I think this is interesting and relevant to most people in the sense that a lot of times when people get financial advice, they talk about, the stock market returns 7% on average, which is a correct statement. That's a roughly true statement from the historical data I've seen. One of those things is that, you can drown in a river that's 2 feet deep on average, right? If it's shallow along most of it and has one very deep channel, you can still drown in the channel. So, you can withdraw 4% a year from an investment strategy that earns 8% a year on average and still go broke, right? Because it depends on the trajectory, the path of sort of what those investment returns are. So that's kind of the central idea I've been interested in, and sort of I think how that applies is I think a lot of investing advice, investment education doesn't tend to make that delineation about like path and ensemble, or like averages can be deceiving in that sense. And so sort of part of my philosophy and how I think about it is it's not just trying to maximize whatever your long-term expected return is. It's also thinking about like the possible path and trajectory by which you get there, right? That if you're, you have a down period or 15-year flat period or whatever it is, and you need to withdraw funds at that time, you're not going to get the averages, right? Because you had inflows and outflows over that period. So yeah, again, a bit of a long-winded thing, but I think that's a really important concept that does have a lot of impact on how most people think about their investments that's not broadly understood.
Okay. So how do you avoid that then? Because I think this connects to some of the other things we've talked about. We've talked about tail risks to an extent, something that seems wildly unpredictable, but it can also happen. It's ergodic in the same way that you could have, the Russian roulette analogy is a perfect example. There's 6 bullets in the chamber. If you get the bullet on the first one, you don't get to live the rest of the 5 empty ones, right? And so the losses are irreversible. And in a similar way, with careers, with a lot of different things in our lives, so you could say careers are non-ergodic in a sense where if you have a company that works their people really hard, grinds them to the bone, you could have a lot of people that potentially burn out. But the thing is, the odds for the individual are not the same as the odds for the company. For the company, they are playing the ensemble. They have 100 people, and every single one of them is going to work however many hours, and a few of them burn out, but they still get the rewards at the end of that. For the individual, each individual, they get the time series average where they actually have to work through every single hour and day after day. And the thing is, let's say you have X odds of burning out. If you burn out early on, that could irreversibly change your ability to work the rest of those hours. So you don't actually get to live the rest of that timeline. Applying that to investing, just like you did, if you take a big loss early on, even though the average result over time is different, you don't actually get to live the rest of that time period. So I'd love to know how you think about, because the thing is with tail risks, a lot of people don't necessarily want to hedge against them. Like if I said, oh, once in 100 years, there's going to be a global pandemic, we just had one a couple years ago. I'm going to think, hey, that gives me a good, 97, 98 years. No need to worry. But the thing is, 1 in 100, that could actually be 5 years from now. And suddenly it's a very different picture. So how do you balance these two ideas?
I like the company and employee thing. I think like between venture capitalists and like startup founders, and like the venture capitalist gets the ensemble return. So oftentimes they're incentivized to say, yeah, go big or go home, see if you can do this really good. Whereas the individual does not get, they get the return of their particular company's trajectory, right? So they, well, maybe let's be a little bit more conservative and we'll take a path that's more likely to work, but maybe isn't as high. So I think, yeah, it is an interesting distinction as well with the company, right? But I think sort of like in the investing context, and I think it's harder to talk about with an individual. In investing, it's a little bit simpler, that like the idea is just thinking more broadly about diversification is like basically the main way to think about it, or thinking more realistically about sort of, what to expect on the future. So like, again, I'll give like rough numbers here. In the case of like, say the average returns of stocks is 7%. Well, the 50th percentile is like 5%, and the 25th percentile is like 2%, and average returns per year, or compound annual growth rate. And so like, yeah, I guess it's like a bit unintuitive, but like the average is highly weighted by the very good outcomes, right? So you have some very, very strong periods and those bring up the average, but like you don't know where you're going to be in those periods. Like, are you going to be investing in that period, or are you not? Is that period going to happen in your lifetime, sort of thing? And then, I think to your point about tail risk and sort of how do you think about the appropriate tail risk, like the number one way to be successful is to not die. The precondition for living is not experiencing death, both like literally and metaphorically. And so eliminating or severely reducing that possibility is very valuable because it allows you to continue to play the game, right? If you can like mitigate that sort of sequencing thing. So I think that's where I think people get tripped up, or it's not exactly intuitive. They're like, oh, this thing is very unlikely to happen, which may very well be true. But like if the impact is sufficiently negative, it's still extremely problematic to sort of what that long-term growth rate is.
Okay, that makes sense. I've heard you mention before Herschel Walker syndrome. Could you explain that?
Yeah, so Herschel Walker was a running back, American football player. He was most famous. He played for the Dallas Cowboys. He was like the great running back of the era, of generation. And well, I don't know, 1990, I'm trying to remember what year it was. He got traded to the Minnesota Vikings, and the trade is like now called the Great Train Robbery. And basically, the Minnesota Vikings like gave up a ton to get it. Like they gave up like 4 first-round draft picks. I can't remember. But basically, they were saying, okay, Herschel Walker is the greatest player of all time, of his generation. If we get Herschel Walker, we're going to win a Super Bowl. And that's sort of that's the number one thing. And Dallas was thinking about it much more from like a portfolio perspective. They're like, all right, we're giving up Herschel Walker, but we're getting 401 draft picks and all this other stuff. And that was sort of like the peak of the Dallas Cowboys. I think they won 3 Super Bowls over like a 5 or 6 year period. And like a lot of the players from the Super Bowl teams were like the draft picks they got from the Herschel Walker trade. And I think a lot of people tend to think about investing in the same way that like the Minnesota Vikings thought about Herschel Walker. It's like, oh, I need to pick the best thing, right? I need to get the number one thing that's going to do the very best. But like what really matters is like how the whole team plays together, right? It's how all the different things, all the assets in the portfolio interact, right? And so, did the Dallas Cowboys get any players that were as good as Herschel Walker? Probably not, but in aggregate, they were better, right? And that's what they could have all those players on the field, and that was sort of the trade. So that's my observation about a lot of people tend to think of investing as like I need to pick the winner, I need to pick the best thing, and they don't think about the overall portfolio and how all the pieces work together. So like coming back to our ergodicity and talking about sequencing risk, it's like sometimes it may be better to add a investment to a portfolio that doesn't have as good of strong returns, but is a diversifier against the rest of the portfolio, right? So tail risk stuff would be something that, like, is it going to have the best long-term returns? Not necessarily, but that's not necessarily the point. The point is, how does it interact with all the other elements in the portfolio?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. How much does it make sense to hedge against these big risks? Because, for example, okay, I can think of a few different models, or a few different people have said things about this. Charlie Munger said, okay, we don't try and be smart, we try and avoid being stupid. I think even in this conversation, we talked about the idea of the best way to survive is not to die. So if you want to be able to live long and benefit from all the experiments you could take, you have to avoid being completely wiped out. I had Luca Delana on the pod a little while back, and he talks about a similar idea where, again, instead of trying to win, you try not to lose. I think he used the example of Elon Musk, where Elon Musk has survived going bankrupt so many times that if you imagined all the other alternate universes where Elon Musk exists, he's probably broke in quite a few of them. And actually, we are living in the one universe where Elon Musk gets to be the richest person in the world simply because he's taken so much risk. And actually, it might be better to optimize for, I think the model Luca uses is, how could I create a situation so that in the maximum number of alternate worlds, I am equally happy? And so I am kind of like cruising along at an equal pace in multiple universes. And so I'm not taking on too much risk that I could be wiped out, which means I don't get to benefit from future attempts. However, going back to what we discussed earlier, there is such a thing potentially as playing it too safe and not taking enough risk. And actually, if you don't take any risks, or you take risks too infrequently, you're not used to risks when they arise. And so the big risks that you do feel are so much more painful because of that. So how do you think of the balance there, both in investing and in life in general, of balancing, okay, we need to build some muscles of learning to take risks, but then also you don't want to take so much risk that you could be potentially wiped out?
Yeah, I like the exercise example you gave, like jumping off a wall is nice, right? Like you want more moderate stressors or more moderate risk and less significant tail risk, right? So like I think someone's like running a small business or working a small business, you have a lot more moderate risk. This client doesn't pay, this thing doesn't happen, but you're a little bit more in control of your destiny, right? Like you're sort of like directly interfacing with the market. So you don't want to eliminate risk, it's that you want to eliminate the very, very big risk, and you want to take more of the appropriate medium-term risk. So like one of the concepts I had in the end of jobs is this idea of like stair stepping in your career, that like you want to try and do something that's like reasonably adjacent to your skill set, as opposed to like, oh, I'm going to leave my corporate law job and I'm going to go do like an AI startup where I have no experience in AI and whatever, right? Like that's a lot harder than like, I'm going to leave my whatever job and I'm going to do something that's like reasonably adjacent to it, where like my existing network and skills or whatever are somewhat transferable, and do it right. Like it's still a risk, but it's not like I'm going to start from scratch kind of thing. So that tends to be the way I think about it career-wise.
So, from your time running the Mutiny Fund, is there anything that you've learned from your time as an investor that you can apply to the rest of your life, in terms of whether it's the level of risk you undertake or the way that you approach starting certain projects? Has that changed the way that you think about any other aspects of life?
It's a good question. I'm not sure. I think like I do think about the ergodicity stuff a lot, and like the path dependency stuff a lot more. I'm not sure I have like any like great concrete examples, other than just like those things tend to be on my mind a lot more when I'm like thinking about particular decisions. Like what is the sort of like trajectory or the path here? I'm a big fan of Luca's work. That same way of like, okay, across multiple universes, like how do I maximize the probability, maximize the number of them in which things work out pretty good. I think that's maybe one shift in my thinking as a result of it. And I think, yeah, I don't know. I think that's the main thing that comes to mind.
Okay, fair. Just because it came to my mind from what you said, could you explain the Helsinki Bus Station Theory?
Oh yeah, no, I would love to. I think it was a commencement address at a photography school, an arts and design school. So the Helsinki bus station, the way the bus routes are designed is there's sort of a central station, and I've actually never been to the Helsinki bus station, but this is how it goes in the story at least. And all the bus routes start leaving along the same path. They're leaving the main road out of the bus, and you can think of each of these stops as like a year in your career. And so everyone, whatever, gets done with high school, graduates from university, and like you kind of start off on the same trajectory, right? And you get, oftentimes you'll get a year or two in and you'll look around and you'll say, I'm kind of doing the same thing everyone else is doing. You're an artist, you're looking around at your work and you're going, oh, this is derivative, right? I'm doing this, like I'm copying some other artist that I like, right? I'm doing some sort of copy derivative thing. And what a lot of people do is they get off the bus and they go back to the bus station and they get on another bus. And then you go 2 or 3 stops and you look around and you get into the same scenario. Oh, everyone else is at this bus stop. Everything's going different. Everything looks the same. And so I'm going to go back to the bus station. And so the Helsinki Bus Station Theory is you stay on the bus, because the further the bus gets out from the bus station, the paths start to diverge, right? And you're sort of, in the context of like, if you're an artist, you're doing photography, right? Your work starts to evolve, it starts to get unique, you start to develop your own sense of taste. First, there's maybe a blend of 2 or 3 artists that you admire. And like now you've taken that, you've incorporated and you've done something slightly different, like in the same in your context of your career. Like I think, most people 3 to 5 years in their career, like, I don't know how much novel stuff are they doing? Like, probably not that much. I mean, there's research on this as well. Like, I think there's still like sort of like average age of like Nobel Prize winners. And like, I think it's usually like 12 to 15 years into their career or something like that. There's something like that. Like, it takes them a while to get to the edge of whatever they're working on, right? Like the 3rd year PhD student is usually not doing something groundbreaking. They're doing something derivative, just like getting them closer to sort of the frontier of their field. So like, I guess coming back to like our compass and our gyroscope, it's like, what does that sort of gyroscope down the bus path look like? And sort of how do you stay on the bus of like, how can you take what you've already got, the skills, the assets, the relationships, all those sorts of things, and weave them into the next thing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And just the last thing you were saying made me think of what you talk about also in your book, which is this idea of apprenticeships. And because, okay, you mentioned the Nobel Prize winners, you might also know that a disproportionate number of Nobel Prize winners worked for or with other Nobel Prize winners. And you can find some, almost like factories, unintentional factories, where there are 2 or 3 different Nobel Prize winners that all worked at one point within the same university working with one particular person. That person themselves may not even have a Nobel Prize, but at least there was a starting point where all of them kind of diverged from. And I think that's also another underrated aspect of life building or career building, which is just kind of learning from other people as well.
Very much, yeah. Kevin Kelly, he has a term he uses called the scenius that I like. You see this in history a lot, that like how creativity emerges in certain groups. So, like Paris in the 20s or the Vienna Circle. Someone was telling me about this, like this is an AI thing. That, like a lot of the most forward AI people were the same. They were like, there was like 2 labs 10 years ago, right? There was like 2 people that a lot of them were working for, that like that was sort of the promising approach that they all came out of.
Yeah, exactly. Wow. I think that's a perfect place to end. I think we've covered so much really interesting stuff. I personally am probably going to, have to sit down and go through the video, go through the notes. And yeah, this will be a really interesting episode for a lot of people.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And thank everyone that stuck around this long. Thanks for listening.
But yeah, thanks again for coming on, man. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for tuning in. Please do stay tuned for more. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. It really helps the podcast. And follow me on Twitter. Feel free to shoot me any thoughts. See you next time.